Ladies and gentlemen, today I stand before you to speak about a truth that has echoed through the annals of history. When the survival and dignity of a nation are at stake, the lines between crime and heroism blur. When a nation's freedom, dignity, and survival are at risk, standing up to protect it is an act of patriotism, not a crime. Throughout history, countless individuals have been forced to make difficult decisions, whether to obey unjust laws or to resist for the greater good of their country. True patriots understand that loyalty to their homeland sometimes requires defying systems that threaten its well-being. In times of crisis, laws may not always reflect justice. Governments, regimes, and ruling powers have often manipulated legal frameworks to serve their interests rather than the people's. Those who challenge these unjust systems are frequently branded as criminals, yet their actions are driven by a higher sense of duty. The laws of a nation are meant to protect its people, but when they become tools of oppression, resisting them is not a crime, it is a necessity. Consider the countless freedom fighters who stood up against colonial rule. At the time, they were labeled rebels, traitors, and criminals. However, history now recognizes them as the architects of independence. Mahatma Gandhi, for example, was imprisoned for leading nonviolent protests against British rule in India. At that time, his actions were deemed illegal, but today he is celebrated as the father of the nation. His defiance was not driven by personal gain, but by an unwavering love for his country and a vision of a free, just society. Similarly, Nelson Mandela was sentenced to prison for 27 years because he opposed apartheid in South Africa. The ruling government saw him as a criminal, yet he was fighting for basic human rights and equality. When the oppressive system finally fell, Mandela emerged not as a criminal, but as a unifying leader who changed his country for the better. His struggle was never about breaking laws for selfish reasons, but about challenging an unjust system that denied freedom to millions. But beyond political struggles, there are moments when ordinary citizens must take extraordinary actions to defend their nation. Soldiers on the battlefield do not question whether their actions align with civilian laws. They fight to protect their land, their people, and their way of life. If an enemy invades, citizens who take up arms to defend their country are not criminals, but defenders of their homeland. Their duty is to the nation, not to laws that may have been created in times of peace, but fail to address the realities of war and survival. Patriotism is not about blind obedience to laws or governments. True patriotism is about standing for what is right, even when it means personal sacrifice. Many leaders, thinkers, and revolutionaries have faced persecution because they dared to go against the status quo. Their defiance was not rooted in hatred or chaos, but in love for their nation and a desire to see it thrive. There are also instances where governments themselves recognize that actions taken in defense of the nation should not be considered crimes. During wars, acts that would normally be considered illegal, such as destruction of property, espionage, or even targeted attacks, are accepted as necessary measures for national security. This reinforces the idea that when a country's survival is at stake, the definition of crime changes. However, it is crucial to differentiate between true patriotism and reckless violence. Not every act in the name of nationalism is justifiable. True patriotism is about protecting the values and freedoms of a nation, not destroying them. It is about ensuring justice, not enforcing one's personal beliefs through force. Those who truly act for the good of their country do so with integrity, purpose, and a vision for a better future. History has proven time and again that those who stand up for their country in times of crisis are often misunderstood in the present but honored in the future. The line between crime and heroism is drawn by time, perspective, and the lasting impact of one's actions. When faced with the choice between obeying an unjust rule and fighting for the greater good, the true patriot chooses the latter, knowing that no sacrifice is too great when the survival of their country is at stake. Many individuals who stood up for their country and its people were once labeled criminals, traitors, or rebels, but history ultimately vindicated them as heroes. The perception of justice and legality is often influenced by those in power, meaning that those who challenge oppression, injustice, or foreign rule are frequently seen as threats to the existing system. However, time has a way of revealing the true nature of their actions, transforming their legacy from that of a so-called criminal to that of a national hero. Throughout history, leaders and revolutionaries have been persecuted for their attempts to bring change. When these individuals opposed oppressive regimes, colonial rulers, or corrupt systems, they were often arrested, imprisoned, or even executed. Yet as time passed, their actions were recognized as the foundation upon which a nation's freedom or progress was built. They did not act for personal gain, but for the welfare of their country, which is why history remembers them differently than the authorities who sought to silence them. A striking example is Mahatma Gandhi, who led India's independence movement through nonviolent resistance. The British colonial government saw him as a threat and arrested him multiple times. To them, he was a lawbreaker who defied British rule. However, today, Gandhi is regarded as one of the greatest leaders in history, a symbol of peace and resistance against injustice. His actions were never about rebellion for its own sake, but about securing dignity and freedom for millions of people. Similarly, Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for nearly 3 decades because he stood against apartheid in South Africa. At the time, the ruling government called him a criminal, branding him a terrorist for his resistance. But the same world that once accepted his imprisonment later celebrated him as a leader who dismantled an unjust system and brought unity to his country. Today, Mandela is remembered not as a criminal, but as a symbol of justice, equality, and perseverance. His story proves that history has the power to correct the wrongful labels given by oppressive systems. Even outside politics, many individuals who fought for their country in times of war or crisis were treated as criminals at first. Joan of Arc, for example, led France's army to victories against English invaders in the 15th century. Despite her dedication to her homeland, she was captured, accused of heresy, and executed. Yet centuries later, she was declared a saint, and today she is honored as a French national hero. Her fate is a reminder that those who act with courage and love for their country may face persecution in their time, but history will recognize their sacrifices. There are also cases where resistance against injustice was labeled as illegal, even though it was morally right. The American Civil Rights Movement, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., challenged racial segregation in the United States. Many of their peaceful protests were met with arrests, police violence, and accusations of lawlessness. Yet today, they are honored as pioneers who reshaped the nation and stood for fundamental human rights. The same laws that once criminalized their actions were later overturned, proving that legal systems can be flawed, but history remembers those who fought for justice. This pattern repeats itself across different nations and struggles. Those who challenge oppressive rulers or unjust policies often face imprisonment, exile, or worse. Yet, the world eventually recognizes their contributions and the righteousness of their cause. Laws change, governments fall, and nations progress, but the legacy of those who fought for what was right remains untarnished. It is important to understand that just because an action is labeled illegal at one point in history does not mean it is wrong. What matters is the intent behind the action, whether it is for selfish reasons or for the greater good of the people. The true test of justice is time itself. History vindicates those who acted selflessly for the betterment of their country, proving that the pursuit of freedom, justice, and equality is never a crime, even if the law of the time says otherwise. When laws are unjust or used to suppress people, resisting oppression is not a crime. It is a moral duty. Throughout history, laws have been created to maintain order, but not all laws have been just or fair. Some have been designed to benefit a ruling elite, enforce discrimination, or silence those who seek justice. In such cases, obeying the law is not an act of virtue, and breaking it is not necessarily a crime. Instead, standing against injustice, even if it means defying the law, is often the right course of action. A fundamental principle of justice is that laws should protect the rights and dignity of all people. However, many oppressive governments and regimes have twisted legal systems to maintain power and control. When laws serve as tools of tyranny rather than justice, individuals who stand against them are often punished. Yet, as history has shown, those who resist unjust laws are not criminals, they are the ones who pave the way for real justice and change. One of the most famous examples of this is the fight against racial segregation in the United States. During the 20th century, laws in many parts of the country enforced racial discrimination, denying basic rights to African Americans. Activists like Martin Luther King Jr. led peaceful protests and civil disobedience campaigns, deliberately breaking segregation laws to challenge their legitimacy. At the time, these actions were considered illegal and many activists were arrested. However, history now recognizes their resistance as necessary and just. Had they obeyed the unjust laws, progress would never have been made and equality would have remained a distant dream. Similarly, during World War II, many people risked their lives to defy the laws of Nazi Germany. Citizens who hid Jewish families, helped prisoners escape, or resisted in any way were considered criminals under Nazi law. But were their actions truly crimes? Of course not. They were acts of humanity, courage, and righteousness. The world now honors these individuals as heroes who stood against one of the most oppressive regimes in history. Their defiance was not just an act of rebellion, it was a stand for human dignity and morality. The same principle applies to movements against colonial rule. Colonizers often passed laws to suppress native populations, preventing them from seeking independence. Revolutionary leaders like Nelson Mandela in South Africa and Mahatma Gandhi in India broke these laws to fight for freedom. At the time, they were arrested and labeled as criminals, but today they are celebrated as national heroes. If they had blindly followed unjust laws, their countries might never have gained independence. Their actions remind us that legal systems are not always aligned with justice, and that true morality sometimes requires breaking the law. Even in modern times, there are instances where laws are used to suppress freedom of speech, silence journalists, or imprison political opponents. In such cases, those who expose the truth, challenge corruption, or stand up for human rights may be punished under existing laws. However, their actions are not criminal in the moral sense. They are necessary for the progress of society. If people never challenged oppressive laws, societies would never evolve and injustice would continue unchecked. It is important to understand that not all disobedience is justified. True resistance against unjust laws must be guided by principles of justice, nonviolence, and the greater good. It is not about lawlessness or personal gain, but about ensuring that legal systems serve the people rather than oppress them. When individuals or groups stand against unjust laws with the intent of creating a fairer society, they are not criminals, they are the protectors of justice. History proves that legal systems can be flawed, and that laws can sometimes be used as instruments of oppression. However, those who resist such laws in the name of justice, equality, and freedom are ultimately remembered not as criminals, but as the ones who change the world for the better. Their defiance is a reminder that laws should serve justice, and when they fail to do so, standing against them is not a crime, it is a necessity. Brave individuals who stand against tyranny and injustice often make great sacrifices, but their actions shape the future of their nations. Throughout history, progress and freedom have been won not by those who remain silent, but by those who are willing to risk everything for the greater good. Sacrifices, whether in the form of personal hardships, imprisonment, or even loss of life, have been the foundation of national independence, civil rights, and social change. Without these sacrifices, oppression would continue unchecked, and future generations would be left to suffer under unjust systems. Every great movement for freedom and justice has been led by individuals who understood that progress comes at a cost. These individuals were often persecuted, exiled, or even executed, but their sacrifices inspired others and led to lasting change. They did not act for personal gain, but for the betterment of their people and their country. The world today enjoys many rights and freedoms because of the struggles and sacrifices made by those who came before us. One of the most well-known examples is Mahatma Gandhi, who sacrificed his personal comfort, wealth, and ultimately his life to lead India to independence from British rule. Through nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience, he united millions in the fight against colonial oppression. He was imprisoned multiple times, endured immense hardships, and faced constant threats. Yet he never wavered. His sacrifices not only freed India, but also inspired movements for justice around the world. Had he chosen personal safety over the struggle for freedom, India's path to independence might have been much longer and bloodier. Similarly, Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison for his fight against apartheid in South Africa. He could have chosen a life of comfort by accepting the unjust system, but instead, he stood against racial segregation, knowing the consequences. His imprisonment was a sacrifice, but it became a powerful symbol of resistance, inspiring people in South Africa and beyond to continue the fight. When he was finally released, his leadership helped dismantle apartheid and rebuild a nation based on equality. His sacrifice was not in vain. It paved the way for a new, just society. The American Civil Rights Movement also saw incredible sacrifices. Martin Luther King Jr. faced constant threats, arrests, and ultimately assassination because he refused to accept racial discrimination. Rosa Parks was arrested simply for refusing to give up her seat on a bus, an act that sparked a nationwide movement. Many activists endured police brutality, economic hardship, and social exclusion. Yet, because of their sacrifices, the Civil Rights Act was passed, transforming American society and ensuring greater equality for future generations. In times of war and foreign invasion, countless soldiers and ordinary citizens have sacrificed their lives to protect their homelands. During World War II, resistance fighters in occupied countries risked everything to fight against Nazi rule. Many were executed, imprisoned, or tortured, but their efforts contributed to the eventual liberation of their nations. Without their sacrifices, tyranny could have prevailed, and the world today would be a very different place. Sacrifices are not always made in the form of imprisonment or loss of life. Some give up their careers, families, or personal dreams to serve their country. Journalists who expose corruption, activists who challenge dictatorships, and whistleblowers who reveal government abuses all put themselves at great risk. They may be forced into exile, lose their livelihoods, or face threats to their lives, but their courage ensures that truth prevails and justice is upheld. While sacrifices shape a nation's future, it is important to remember that they are not made in vain. Those who stand for justice today may suffer in the present, but history will remember them as heroes. The freedoms and rights enjoyed by millions today are the result of sacrifices made by a few in the past. Progress is never given. It is earned through the struggles and sacrifices of those who refuse to accept oppression. Their legacy ensures that future generations will not have to fight the same battles, making their sacrifices the foundation of a better world. Patriotism is not about blind obedience to authority. It is about standing up for what is right, even if it means challenging those in power. True patriotism is rooted in love for one's country and its people, not in unquestioning loyalty to a government or leader. Throughout history, those who have truly loved their nations have often been the ones who resisted injustice, corruption, and oppression, even when such resistance was labeled as a crime. Their actions were not betrayals, but rather acts of deep devotion to the ideals of justice, freedom, and national progress. Many oppressive regimes have attempted to equate loyalty to the government with patriotism. They have labeled those who criticize them as traitors, rebels, or criminals. However, a nation is not defined by its rulers, it is defined by its people, culture, and values. When a government becomes corrupt or oppressive, true patriots are those who speak out and fight to restore justice. Silence in the face of tyranny is not patriotism, it is complicity. Those who challenge unfair systems are not enemies of the state, but defenders of the nation's true spirit. History is filled with examples of individuals who challenge their governments for the sake of their country. The American Revolution was not a rebellion against the people of Britain, but against an unfair system of taxation and governance. The founding fathers of the United States, such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, were considered traitors by the British government. However, their actions were driven by a desire to create a nation based on liberty and justice. Today, they are celebrated as heroes, not criminals. In more recent times, whistleblowers and activists have exposed corruption, human rights violations, and abuse of power within their governments. These individuals often face imprisonment, exile, or even assassination, yet they choose to act because they believe their country deserves better. They do not seek to harm their nation. They seek to protect it from those who exploit it for personal gain. Their courage ensures that justice prevails even when those in power try to silence them. Even in democratic societies, patriotism does not mean agreeing with everything a government does. Protests, civil disobedience, and calls for reform are essential to ensuring that a country remains true to its founding principles. The right to question authority and demand better from leaders is a fundamental part of a healthy democracy. If past generations had simply accepted injustice in the name of patriotism, many nations would still be under colonial rule, racial segregation, or dictatorship. True patriotism also involves protecting the rights and freedoms of all citizens, not just a privileged few. It means fighting for equality, justice, and the well-being of future generations. When individuals stand up against discrimination, economic exploitation, or environmental destruction, they are acting out of love for their country. They refuse to let greed, corruption, or injustice define their nation's future. At times, patriotic resistance comes at a great personal cost. Those who challenge unjust systems may lose their freedom, their reputations, or even their lives. However, their sacrifices often lead to a better future. Nations grow stronger when their citizens are willing to fight for justice, even when it is difficult. The greatest heroes are often those who dared to defy oppression, not those who blindly followed orders. In the end, patriotism is not about following leaders without question. It is about upholding the values that make a nation truly great. Justice, equality, and freedom are worth fighting for, even when those in power claim otherwise. The true measure of a patriot is not their obedience, but their willingness to defend what is right, even in the face of adversity. Those who stand for justice are not criminals. They are the ones who shape a nation's destiny. History remembers those who fought for justice, not those who enforced oppression. The world has always been shaped by individuals who refused to accept injustice, who challenged unfair systems, and who stood up for what was right, even when it meant defying the law. These individuals were often labeled as criminals or rebels during their time, but history has proven them to be heroes. Their courage, sacrifice, and determination changed the course of nations, ensuring a better future for generations to come. Oppressive rulers, corrupt governments, and unjust systems have always sought to suppress those who challenge them. Many who fought for freedom, equality, and human rights were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Yet their actions sparked revolutions, movements, and reforms that reshaped societies. Their legacy lives on, not as criminals, but as visionaries who dared to fight against oppression. One of the clearest examples is the abolition of slavery. At the time, those who helped enslaved people escape, such as Harriet Tubman, were considered criminals under the law. The Underground Railroad was illegal, and those who participated risked severe punishment. Yet today, Tubman is celebrated as a hero who helped countless people find freedom. The laws she broke were unjust, and history acknowledges her resistance as necessary for human rights and dignity. Similarly, those who resisted colonial rule were often branded as traitors or rebels by the ruling powers. Yet, figures like Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, and Simon Bolivar are now regarded as national heroes. Their defiance led to the liberation of their countries and the establishment of self-governance. Had they accepted the status quo, their nations would have remained under foreign rule or apartheid for much longer. Even in modern times, whistleblowers and activists continue to challenge corruption and injustice. Journalists who expose government abuses, citizens who protest against oppression, and leaders who demand reforms all face persecution. However, history will remember them not as criminals, but as individuals who fought for truth and justice. The passage of time reveals who the real criminals are, not those who resist injustice, but those who enforce it. Laws may declare someone a criminal today, but history will judge them by their actions and their impact on the world. Those who fight for justice, even at great personal cost, are the ones who leave a lasting legacy of freedom, dignity, and progress.